They are white. They are maximum force. Because you can't get legal anything. If you are always illegal, you can. Years ago, you have to feed the subway, to get the pocket money, the self-pocket money. Income. Assets, yes.
And it's like 1,600,000 pounds. She's one of the richest ladies in the world.
No, the president of Chechnya is more rich.
But she got it, and he actually declared that she shouldn't be eligible to
Depending on the contract.
Yes, but since they now live in Great Britain, and the British laws were applied,
You know, the president of Monaco football club is Russian. He did divorce about 3 years ago with the Russian lady. They were married for 17 years. She got the French law, French Monaco, but for that, she got billions of euros. For me, paid not in one way, but she's happy with the French law. Yeah, of course. He's a get.
Даже в Америке-то я он почти не встречала женщины, которые по такой уж прям большой. Одна там негритянка из мексиканца вышла, говорит, мне надо, у меня, говорит, мать, и нас 4 детей. Мне надо, говорит, тянуть себя. Да не добилась. Купила какого-то дипломата американского. Говорит, до этого толстого своего мужа я, говорит, от него сладости. Зато мы ехали на открытом по Калифорнии.
Today we have a very, very special guest. I would like to introduce you to Thayer, who has a very strong background in developing international markets for several successful companies in Portland. And he is now an adjunct faculty at Portland State University. And today, Jim will be talking about very important social phenomenon in the United States in the 1950s. He will be talking about the epoch of MacCarthysm. And this is also a very personal matter for him because his father, he used to be one of the first diplomats here in Moscow to establish the American embassy in Soviet Moscow, I mean. And his father has also experienced a lot of pressure because of this MacCarthysm time and the anti-communist pressure. So I'm passing the mic.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk to you. I have a nice selection of slides that I just recently was able to unearth from a huge a stockpile of boxes from my parents. And hidden in all that stuff, I knew there was an album of photographs going back to 1934 here in Moscow. And I had to make several attempts to locate this box amongst all the other boxes. And I was finally able to find it, and I then digitized them, and so I can share them with you. And I thought I would go through them perhaps a little bit more quickly so we can talk about some of the social issues and my own experience, if you will, as a result of what you'll see. So I think it'll give you a perspective on where I'm, you'll have a perspective on my perspective.
Conception of MacCarthysm of ideal and future.
Right. I am the product of this problem, one of them. So first, this is my father, who he went to West Point because my grandfather was a commander of one of the National Guard units in Philadelphia, and so my father used to go out on maneuvers, and I have some pictures at home. They're not part of this. Of going out and watching them do the cavalry maneuvers in 1915. And if you think about it, it's kind of ironic because, you know, the First World War changed the way we fought wars, and it completely eliminated the idea of using horses because the machine gun finished that business. So you have all these pictures of great cavalry charges and things like that happening in 1915 when they're preparing for the First World War. And then when the First World War came, the type of warfare changed so totally that the idea of cavalry charges was suicidal. So, I mean, we learned that in Gallipoli, in the charge of the Light Brigade. If you know there's a poem, very famous poem, about that, and it's all about the futility, essentially, of trying to wage a war with horses after the invention of the machine gun. So, but this is a presentation about my father's experiences here. So this is my father in about 1915. He's probably about 8 years old or so, and is wearing a Cossack uniform. And the reason for that is that my grandfather also was the chief engineer in the shipbuilding business in Philadelphia. And in 1905, the Russians suffered a great defeat in the Battle of Tsushima. I think you may call it the Port Arthur, but the Japanese call it Tsushima. And many of your ships were sunk. Well, it was awfully good business for our shipyard. And so they were building the replacements for the Russian Navy. And when they would get close to being finished with the ship, the captain would come over maybe a month before, and then maybe 2 or 3 weeks before the ship was operational, the officers would come so they could understand how to run the ship. So they would live at my grandmother's house. And we had one whole floor that was reserved for the visiting officers and the captains of the ships. And so there was a personal connection at home with the idea of Russia. And my grandfather used to come here to do business during the Tsarist, before the revolution. So we had a long family history of doing business with Russia. And as a result, that's how my father acquired this Cossack uniform. This is Spaso House in 1934. So my father decided that after he had gotten out of West Point, he had a very difficult time with it. And he used to tell me that he had the most demerits, or negative marks, if you will, and still got through West Point because he absolutely hated it. And he decided he was not good material for the army because he was not willing to accept all his orders without any question. And so he decided that he would rather be a diplomat. And at that time there was a hiring freeze, and the State Department was not looking for new people. But he was very interested in doing this anyway. And so he talked to various people, and he learned that there was some planning to maybe have an office in Moscow. And so he decided on his own to come here by himself. And at that time, everything was chaotic. It was, not that long after the revolution. Things were in a big mess. And he came here and he found a place to live and learned Russian. He didn't speak any Russian when he first came. And he came here to learn. He lived with a family.
As local business hours end shortly, we remind our mission employees to properly secure our workspaces to include sensitive and classified information. Locally engaged staff remain passive.
All right, and so he came here on his own, hoping to get a job once they decided to come and open the embassy. And so eventually, Mr. Bullitt, the first ambassador, came, and he met my father.
As regular business hours end shortly, remind all mission employees to properly secure our workspaces to include sensitive classified information.
How long does this go on?
Staff remain past the close of business hours.
Is it-
5
Okay.
5 minutes.
If you not have proper
Okay. Several seconds, I'll wait.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. And so he was here when Mr. Bullitt first arrived, and they met in the bar of the National Hotel, and he was hired. And his first job was to find the location for the new embassy. And he managed to find the Spaso House, which at that time was a bit of a wreck, and so they had to fix it. And he was running around town trying to find all the parts and all the pieces and fixing the roof and doing all these things before the first mission arrived, so that when Mr. Bullitt came back again officially as the ambassador, he would have an embassy. So this is what it looked like in 1934, and this is the first original staff in 1934. And let's see, my father is right there, and here is the staff in 1935. It's grown some more, and here's 1936. Evidently, they've got a smaller selection, and my father is right here. So he was the lowly third secretary, but he was the one that they all sent out because he spoke. By this time, he spoke very good Russian, and he knew how to get things done in the Soviet system, and nobody else did. So when they needed something, Charlie was the one they sent out. And here he is with Bill Bullitt, and we're talking about a cup of tea. This is actually unusual because in that time, one of the prerequisites for being effective in the Soviet system is that you had to drink and be able to hold your liquor. And so usually he's there's some drinking involved. This is the press corps at that time. Here's my father at that same 4th of July party in 1935, and I don't think he's had maybe a few beers too many at this point. He's resting. And here he is again in the Nemchinovska Dacha staff, and he was very young looking, it's hard to tell who's the staff and who's the boss, if you will. This is his dog, Midget. So you'll notice that in many of the slides, you'll have people, and then there'll be a dog, and then people. My father was a great dog lover, and it's something that I've inherited. And my first dog was called Nikita, after your Nikita Khrushchev. So here's some of the dacha gatherings back in 1935, and it looks like they're having an awfully good time, I must say. Look at this guy. And here they are. And the focus is a little bit poor on this, but I have a feeling that the people in the picture also were having trouble with focus. Here's some more festivities. So, and here's my father here. So I was able to essentially digitize these basically by taking pictures of them. So I'm now in the process of going back and scanning them so that we'll get some better quality. And this is Frederick Reinhardt, who later became ambassador here and in Rome and in Egypt, among other places. And here they are skiing outside of Moscow in 1936. And this is Chip Bohlen, Charles Bohlen, who became ambassador. And he became a very close friend of my father's. And here they are at the dacha over here. And here we are, maybe again after a little bit of drinking. And they became very close friends. And while my father was there, my father's sister came to visit. and she ended up falling in love with Chip, and they ended up having a courtship here, and they eventually got married. And so I've been here presenting this along with my cousin Avi Bohlen, who was ambassador to Bulgaria and was a U.S. ambassador to the SALT talks, and so it all started here. Here they are hunting. So my father was a passionate hunter, and so here he is with some of the staff from the dacha out hunting. And I love this fellow here with the wonderful Georgian mustache here. And here we are again with the dogs, of course. Here they are. This is one of my favorite pictures. So this is my father leaning against the side. And if you notice, there's a few bottles here, and I think there's a gun or two lying around right in here. There's a gun, and then this is Chip Bohlen, who is obviously about in the same shape, very tired, I think, at the very least. And here's my father blending in and learning to become part of the culture. I'm in the first one asleep, and the second one doing what one does best in Russia, and that is drinking lots of vodka. And here they are in 1940 at a reception at the Italian embassy, and this is Chip Bohlen here, and this is my father, and unfortunately the picture is not very clear, original picture. And this is the daughter of the Italian ambassador, and they subsequently met again in Persia, in Iran, when her father was then posted from Moscow to Iran in 1942. This is the apartment that he was living in, and somewhere in there is the dog. I don't see it, but I know he's there. And at the end of this first period, this was the Harriman and Beaverbrook Mission, 1941. This is what set up Lend-Lease, which was essential for the Russians, and we were providing a lot of the equipment for the Russian army in order to be able to confront the Germans on the Eastern Front. So, as you probably know, Lend-Lease was critical to that process. This is the mission that set that up. And here they are. This is Beaverbrook here, and Harriman is here. And here they are at signing it, and my father is third secretary, making sure that all the right copies are there. And then here we have, let's see, this is Beaverbrook here. This is Frederick Reinhardt. This is Molotov. And the interpreter was a gentleman called Pavlov. This was going out to inspect some Polish troops, and they look ready. But unfortunately, the Germans then decided to roll in, and so we had to evacuate along with everybody else. And so they evacuated the embassy to Kuibyshev. And on the way, they were in Kazan, and these are some of the pictures in Kazan. This is, and if you notice right here, there's a rather dark spot. This is my father's dog, and then by this time he had acquired a manservant to help him, and this is Yang. I don't know much about Yang. I've heard about him, and he shows up in some of the pictures. I have no idea whatever happened to him, but he went with my father he was with my father for many years. And you'll see his picture later on when he goes to Afghanistan. So being an avid hunter, this is what I call the Hemingway picture. With his buck. There's an ibex here, and he's got a number of antelopes here. So this must have been a very good day. But it's a beautiful ibex. I remember growing up, these were on the walls of our house. And it made it very difficult. If you bumped into the wall, you could get, a horn stuck in your head. So you had to be very careful. Here, he was also a great fan of Omar Kayan, And here he is at the tomb of Omar Kayan, and like good adventurer that he was, he had a pith helmet here in this picture. He was then asked by the State Department to set up the first embassy in Afghanistan, in Kabul, back in 1942. So he packed up all the materials, the code machines, the ciphers, the safe, all the things that you need to set up an embassy. And they packed it all into this school bus here. And in the very back, they had a 50 caliber machine gun, so that if the bandits decided to give them trouble, they would just open the back door and poke the barrel of the gun out. And usually in this case, in all the cases, the bandits would then decide they didn't really want to attack this particular set of cars. But you can see it's fully packed here with lots of gear up here, extra fuel tank here, and of course the dog Midget alongside. And I personally also did the same route overland in 1970, and I had my father's diaries that described the route, and I took the same route, and the trip in 1970 was actually more difficult than it was in 1942, because they had just put in some of the roads in 1942, and by the time I got there, they'd never built anything else, and those roads had really sort of crumbled into nothing, and the bandits were also still a problem. So I could see them following us from the ridge tops, from the tops of the mountains, and you could see the glint off the binoculars as they were looking at us. But luckily, they never bothered us when I went through. Here they are again. This is Fazal, was one of the people that was helping to set up the embassy. This is a wonderful picture of some of the local tribesmen that my father took. You can see this gentleman has the 4 legs of an antelope tied up on his back. And then this is the actual embassy here that they set up, and it was in bad architectural condition. He had to rebuild it because it sort of fell apart after they bought it. Here's some sort of Mongolian people that he saw on the way, 1942. And here is Yang again, my father, and this is a gentleman by the name of Alan, and this is a gentleman over here called Enders, I believe, and I don't remember who this gentleman. That's Fazal, that's right. And Midget is probably here, but down underneath where you can't see her. This is, I think, a wonderful picture that he took of a blind man being guided in Afghanistan. And it sort of has the picture of the sense of a painting almost. This is much later. This is in 1948. He became the first director of the Voice of America. And here's an interesting page. This is from the photo album that my mother put together. So my father at that time was the consul general for southern Germany. And at that time he was coming under attack by Joe McCarthy for his prior service in Russia, the fact that he spoke perfect Russian, the fact that he had been here before the mission came, all these things that were an asset before and were valued now became a liability. And so he was under attack at that point. So this is this is the house that we lived in at the time when he was consul general in Bad Godesberg, which is right next to Bonn. And that's where I was born, actually, in 1951. And then in the scrapbook here, he names my grandfather, who at that time became the ambassador to France. And but there's no mention here whatsoever of the difficulties that my father was having, because he was under direct attack at that point while they were there. So it's very interesting that my mother completely blanked it out of the pictures, no mention of it whatsoever. And here is the only picture that really that is relevant or points to what happened. This is the convoy of cars. They had an old Buick and a Jeep and a trailer, and they drove from Germany down to Mallorca. Mallorca at that time was not a tourist destination by any means. It was a very dry and dusty island in the Mediterranean. We had no electricity. We had no running water. And among other things, my father would insist on the essentials of life, which to him were cigarettes, whiskey, antibiotics, and soft toilet paper. And the only way we could get those is we would get up on the roof at night with a lantern and swing the lantern like this out to sea until there was an answering lantern out at sea. And then we would go down to the beach, and a boat would come in, a rowboat would come in, and there'd be hushed discussions about, terms and conditions and what we needed and so forth. And a week later, we would see the light coming from the sea, and we would respond with our lantern, and we'd go down and we would get our essentials from the smugglers, because it was the only way we could get these things. So it was a very primitive life, and we were basically in exile. And this picture to me is very interesting. I don't know how many times, if you've seen pictures of the Great Depression in America, and people who packed up from Oklahoma and went out west to California. We talk about the Okies, and the Okies were essentially also in retreat, if you will, going to California. This is our version, if you will. The international version of the same thing is going into exile, because after he left the Foreign Service, of course, he was what they call blackballed. So he was unable to get a job in the United States. So they had to go find a place where they could live very cheaply, and that in those days was Mallorca. And this is myself here, and this is Celestine Bohlen. So this is the youngest daughter of Chip Bohlen and my aunt Avis, and then their second child was Avi. Their first child was Avis, who was the ambassador to Bulgaria and also to the SALT talks, and who has been with me on this mission. Here's a picture of the family and my grandmother. By this time, my grandfather had been named as the ambassador to Spain, which was helpful because we were in Mallorca, which is part of Spain. And so this is my grandmother, the ambassadress to Spain at that time. My sister, myself, and this is not Midget. This is my grandmother's dog. So you'll notice that there's a theme that runs through this, and it has 4 legs. And this is reading Twas the Night Before Christmas in Munich in 1954. So by this time, the McCarthy period was over, and everybody sort of said, "Oh, whoops, we made a big mistake. Would you come back to the Foreign Service?" Well, my father refused to do that at that point because it was, impossible, because essentially you were tainted, if you will, and the FBI was still hounding him. And the FBI continued to enforce their efforts to keep him from working until 1966. So much later. So J. Edgar Hoover had a personal vendetta, if you will, against my father. And so he when we came back to Germany, we lived in this house, this hut in the Bavarian Alps. Now it's a special guest house for VIPs in the German Department of Forestry. And it's a wonderful, wonderful cabin, way up in the mountains, almost to tree line level, probably only about maybe 2 hours walking from the Austrian border, so way high up in the mountains, up near Berchtesgaden. There I am. Oops. Yeah, there I am with a I'm not sure what you call it. One of the plastic caps that you put over your head. I think it's a very undignified look, but nonetheless, this is Count Turing, who is the count who owned all the fishing rights and all the hunting rights in that area. It was his ancestral inheritance from the times of feudal times. And they were very good friends, my father and Count Turing. So he was at our house a lot. This is another Foreign Service officer, Rebecca Wellington, and they're going out fishing. And my father was a renowned fisherman, was even invited to the 1968 World's Fair to demonstrate fly fishing. And he wrote articles for Time, Life, and Sports Illustrated. And some of the best fishing was in front of our front door. And we would have visitors coming, VIP visitors, generals and diplomats would have come down because it was legendary. People knew that Charlie lived and knew some of the best fishing in Europe. And so he would take them out go fishing. And we then moved to a house very close to that same cabin that I was talking about earlier. This is in a little community called Laubau. It's near Ruhpolding, or it's close to Salzburg in Austria, but it's on the German side of the border. You can see the mountain, the very steep mountain behind here. At the top is basically the Austrian border, which is probably up here somewhere. And so if you cross that mountain, you're in Austria. This is my sister, my mother, my father, and myself, dutifully in my lederhosen, my Austrian leather pants, which I grew up in because we didn't have blue jeans. And this is a picture from later in his life, and they're sitting in a tree stand way up on a tree, waiting for the game to come out and go hunting. This is from a Time Life article about my father. So that's a very quick run-through of my father's life a little bit. I thought you'd be interested in seeing the pictures from that time. But I thought I would tell you a little bit about my own experience with this. So as I was growing up, I grew up speaking Spanish, German, and English simultaneously. And it was a long time before I realized that they were actually separate languages. I just thought, when you're in the kitchen, you speak Spanish, and when you're with the parents, you speak English, and when you're with your friends and your sister, you speak German. And then they sent me off to an American school, and at some point somebody asked me to convey a message to somebody else, and by the time I'd gotten there, I had changed all the words into different languages. And I explained this to the person, and they looked at me blankly and didn't understand what I was trying to say. And at that point, it became clear that I really didn't understand that I was speaking 3 different languages. And I had to learn the difference that certain people only spoke that, and other people only spoke that, etc. And when we all got together as a family, the only language we had in common was French. So we would speak French. With my father, it was even more difficult. He spoke 7 different languages, so Pashtun, Serbo-Croatian, French, Italian, German, Russian, some Persian, Pashtun, so with him in the morning, you had to be very careful because at the breakfast table, he would get a copy of the Herald Tribune, which some of you may remember. He'd have that, and he'd have the Süddeutsche Zeitung, which is the Munich newspaper, and he'd have Pravda. And he would have to be very careful because if you talked to him while he was reading Pravda, he would only talk Russian. And if you talked to him while he was reading the Süddeutsche Zeitung, he would only talk German. So you'd have to either wait, for the right newspaper, then you could talk to him, and he would respond in the language that you could speak. So I was okay with the Süddeutsche Zeitung and the Herald Tribune, but when he was reading Pravda, I left him alone. So at any rate, I grew up with this very deep sort of experience as a European, essentially. And I'm a classic example of what they call the third country child. So you don't belong to the nationality, the cultural nationality of your passport. You don't belong to the country that you're living in, and you come from someplace else different. It's a third country almost. And so I didn't identify as being an American. In fact, I got into a big argument with my father when he told me I was an American. I said, nah, Bavarian. I said, nah, das gibt's nicht. Ich kann kein Ami sein. I can't possibly be an Ami, which was the Bavarian slang for an American. And we used to even have exercises, military exercises, when the special forces would come and they would do special practice in the mountains. There was a camp further up the valley from our house where they would come, and it was so exciting, because as a child I would be lying in bed and just waking up in the morning, and I would hear this, and it'd be the helicopters coming in, dropping off these special forces guys further up in the valley. And I would get together with my friends, and we would go down and take our allowance and go down to the tavern, and we'd buy a big case of beer and a bunch of postcards. And then we would, between two of us, and get on our bicycles, and we would hold the big crate of beer between the two of us, and we would ride up a parallel holding the beer. We'd go up to the camp, and we would sell the beer and the postcards to the soldiers. And they would be talking amongst themselves in English, and they had no idea that this little snotty-nosed kid in lederhosen in front of him was actually an American. I could understand perfectly everything they were saying, but they had no idea, because I looked like every other little Bavarian kid. And so I really didn't identify with being an American. And my father at some point said, "Oh, you're an American." I said, "No, I can't possibly be." And he said, "Well, I tell you what, you have your friend Francie bring his passport over and we'll compare it with yours." Well, they were both green passports, but they were different. And I was very deeply disappointed. And I think for that part of that experience, convinced my father to send me to boarding school in America. And that was a difficult process for me, because I didn't really fit in. I'd been living this sort of idyllic life up in the Bavarian Alps, going hunting and fishing every day. And then the next thing I know, I'm in the east coast of America, and even the football was the wrong shape. Everything was different. I showed up with a duvet, a feather bed, a German feather bed, if you will. And in those days, Americans slept with a sheet and a blanket, and it was all nicely tucked in. And they'd never seen one of these things. They'd, "What are you doing sleeping under a pillow? This is crazy." And I brought music with me, of course, and the music was Beethoven, Mozart, and everybody here in America was listening to Motown and to rock and roll, and I'd never experienced this before, so I had a terrible time. But at any rate, with that kind of a background, I was a natural for the Foreign Service, but I was scared to death of it, because my father's experience, he was a bit of a maverick. He was somebody who you could go out and give him no resources and send him out and do something, he'll do it. But once the organization got really big and very political, then he wasn't so good anymore, because he usually spoke his mind. And if you're working for the Foreign Service, you have to sublimate your own personality and represent your country all the time. And I wasn't sure that I could do that. And I didn't want to go through his experience, because that was pretty dramatic. And so I basically went as far away from that as I could. I moved all the way to the other side of the country and moved to Oregon. And because I didn't really want to be an expat. Living as an expat is very romantic for a lot of people. But if you've lived overseas already, the romance is gone. For me, the romance was the idea of going out west. And I ended up, had a chance to work on a ranch. My cousin had a ranch in Montana, and I absolutely loved it. After I got used to riding an American saddle, which had a trailer hitch on the front, and I was used to riding English saddle, and so when the horse starts to canter, you post like this. Well, the first time I tried that, the cow pony that I was riding stopped and did one of these. What are you doing? And the cowboys thought it was hysterical. And they basically said, Jimmy, stop it. Just let the horse do what he needs to do. He knows more about what you're doing than you do. Just let the horse do it. And so after that, we got along just fine. I left it to the horse to decide what to do. But at any rate, I was very influenced, essentially, as a European, by that kind of romantic image of the West. I remember listening to Dvorak's New World Symphony, and it has that same kind of romantic, sort of Wild West feeling. And so I ended up in Oregon and went to a very tough college there called Reed College, which most people attend, but very few people actually graduate because it's a very difficult school to go to. It was perfect for me because I needed to be under stress and I needed to have a big challenge. And besides that, the weather in Oregon is kind of like the weather today here. It could be pretty miserable, but I figured that if it was miserable, I might actually spend enough time in the library that I would actually get my work done. And it was a really good strategy. It worked. But when I was finished, I looked around and I traveled around Oregon. And Oregon is about the same size as what the country of West Germany. And it's about 4 square meters larger than West Germany. Except that the difference was we had, at that time, I think about 1.5 million people in the state, and Germany had 43 million people in West Germany. So there was a great deal of open space and lots of places to explore, which was very fascinating to me. So I ended up out there. But of course, with the background I have, I tried to go into to high tech. I had a lot of very interesting interviews, but in the end they decided I really wasn't an engineer, which I wasn't. And so I wasn't able to get a job in the technical field that I wanted to get into. And I ended up, to make a long story short, I ended up going on and getting an advanced degree in international business management from Thunderbird University down in Arizona. And I came back to Portland, and I went in and talked to the people at the state that were running their programs, and I was rather cheeky, and I sort of said, well, you know, government support for international business, isn't that a sort of an oxymoron? Doesn't that contradict? And they kind of looked at me, and I chuckled, and I thought, well, I'd never get a call from them after that comment. And about 2 weeks later, they called me and they said, we want you to come in for an interview because we have a position. And so they actually hired me. And it was very interesting because I was doing the export promotion, the same as you have here with the Department of Commerce. But at that time, we were beginning to get inquiries from companies that were wanting to move into the United States, put their manufacturing in the United States, because America was going through a period of isolationism, again, as we regularly do. But by law, I couldn't work with any foreign companies. I couldn't spend Oregon tax money on anything except Oregon companies. So I had to go and figure out what to do. And I got my boss to agree that I would do all the export promotion in 50% of my time, and the other 50% he would close his eyes. And I went to the business community and said, do you think we need some people to help attract foreign business to set up factories here? And they said, well, yes, of course we do. I said, well, in that case, I need you to set up a budget for me, and I'll begin working on it. But I did a sort of an end run around the state system and essentially funded my program independently through the business community, which, if you realize, is pretty illegal. But during that period, we did that for about 6 months before we got the legislature to change the law so that I could actually do my job legally. And we were one of the very first states to go out and begin to do trade missions and do investment missions, mainly focusing on Japan, Taiwan, Korea, and then later China. Some work in Germany as well. And we were very successful doing that. We were one of the very first states to do that. and we attracted something like $5.2 billion worth of investment. We had 2 semiconductor plants, a Winchester disk drive plant, and a lot of different suppliers that came with it. It was a very successful program. Today, if you go back and you look at all the places where the Japanese invested and built these big plants, there's very few Japanese companies left. There's one, Epson is still there, but all the other ones are no longer Japanese. But the important thing is the buildings are full and they're actually employing people and they're operating. So the effort in the long run, even though the companies involved changed, the boost to the economy continued and it grew, and so it was excellent, an excellent result for us, if you will. So at any rate, I ended up basically doing the same things that I would have done if I was a Foreign Service officer, except I was doing it at the state level. And because we were just starting these programs, I basically was able to invent it as I went. And I wrote the first book on how to invest in Oregon, which was a big book on management issues, on tax issues, on legal issues, etc. that you need to know as a foreign company if you're going to operate in that area. And basically invented the whole idea of a reverse investment mission. And pretty soon we had other states doing it too. But we were one of the very first ones to do that. We changed our tax laws. We had a tax called the unitary tax, which a lot of the companies, the British and the Dutch and the Japanese in particular, were very much against this tax because it essentially taxed their entire company all around the world and then applied sort of an averaging formula to say, okay, if you have this much, then Oregon's share is this much. But it meant that they had to provide all kinds of information that had nothing to do with Oregon, and they hated that. And so they wouldn't invest in any place that had the unitary tax. So I was able to convince the governor that we need to get rid of it. And we had a special session of the legislature, and we voted something like 97-3 to get rid of this tax. And the next day, that decision was on the front page of the Asahi Shimbun in Tokyo. And we had timed a trade mission to be in Tokyo when that happened. And so we were all over the newspapers, all over the TVs, and we met with all these companies. And with that trade mission alone brought us something like 6 different plants into Oregon because they wanted to reward the leader that changed and it did away with the unitary tax. So we were very successful in doing that. I worked for them for about 9 years until I figured out that the real estate people that were working with me were making a fortune, literally a fortune. And I was being paid government salary, which meant I was making somewhere around $40,000 a year and struggling. And I realized, wait a second, maybe if I go in the private sector, I can make some more money. So I did that, and I ended up working for a series of 3 different high-tech startups, and I set up international distribution in 60 countries. The first time it took me about 4 years to do it, and then I got it down to about 3 years and 2 years, and set up all these international offices and distribution and retail and in Europe, in Asia, in South America, in never related to Africa, but in South America and Asia. And so I did that for about 10 years, which meant a great deal of travel. I was used to the travel, but it was very difficult for my family, of course, because they rarely saw me. I would have, at one point I was doing a round-the-world trip once a quarter. And I would leave Portland on a Sunday evening and catch a flight to London, and I would spend a week in Europe, and I would end up in Salzburg, where my friends were that I grew up with, and then I would have a terrible hangover the next morning, but I would drag myself down to the train station and then go down to Munich and catch a flight. And there was a flight out of Frankfurt at noon that I had to get to that went straight to Tokyo. And I would go to Tokyo, and then I would start all over and go from Tokyo to Seoul, to Beijing, down to Singapore, and down all the way down to Sydney. And then from Sydney, I'd fly back to Oregon. And because of time difference, I would actually make it on Friday, because I would get to Sydney on Friday and leave on Friday and fly 15 hours to get home. But because of the time difference, I still got there the same day. So in 2 weeks, I would cover the world every 4 months. Would do that. So it was really difficult. And at the end of that period, my wife came to me and said, you know, this isn't going to work. You either have to change your job or I'm going to leave you. And so I thought about that, and I said, I really want to have a family, and I really do love my wife. So I changed my job. And I ended up then working for the city of Portland, doing essentially the same thing again, doing trade missions and investment missions, but at a much lower level and doing much more domestic work. So I was receiving companies instead of going out. I was actually reduced my travel a great deal, and did that for a period of about 5 years, and then worked in energy efficiency, which is a growing field, and did a lot of work in auditing the programs that were being introduced. And Oregon was one of the leaders in this area, where, for instance, they would have programs to change the light bulbs in buildings, and they would have social programs to teach people how to do that, provide incentives through the power company, and then they would do that over an area, and then they would claim that they had saved X amount of energy. And my job was essentially to take their programs and to audit them and figure out if they really had done that. It was a very technical process, and we had to do these long reports. I did that for about 10 years. So that was quite interesting. And at that point, I decided to basically, I was in my mid-50s, so I was beginning to slow down. And one of the things that I did is I began teaching. So now I teach international marketing at Portland State University in Portland, and I also write. I'm an avid hiker, and have written a number of hiking books on, for instance, most recent one is called Hiking from Portland to the Coast. So it goes through about 250 miles of wilderness and describes 2 different routes to go all the way to the coast. But what's interesting about the book is that I've always believed that if you're out in the woods, you know, sometimes it's hard to understand what you're going through. It's just a bunch of trees, and you know, every intersection in the forest looks like the other one. And so, you know, what's so special about this? Well, I went and actually did the research on all these hikes and figured out what happened when the Indians were there, what happened when the first settlers came in 1843, what happened during the heyday of the logging industry, when they had railroads running all through the mountains picking up logs, and then what's happening today in those areas. So giving a full history of the places and going back and researching through the records of the small towns where they had sort of little pamphlets they had produced in the 1960s and 70s that had been gathering dust. And I began collecting all these because they had wonderful stories about the experiences of different families, and so I began to write those up as part of this book, and that's what I'm doing now. Is I'm doing a great deal of research on, for instance, the Indians that lived in our area. I don't know if you know, but the Portland area used to be the most densely populated area in all of North America before the white men arrived. And then after the white men arrived, the people who had been living in the Portland area, the Chinook Indians, had been there for 6,000 years, and they were the most successful Indians. They were still hunter-gatherers. They didn't farm, but they were considered advanced hunter-gatherers by anthropologists because they had such a sophisticated society. Well, the reason was they were next to the Columbia River, where you had all the fish you could ever want. You had mountains full of deer and elk behind you, and you had a ton of birds coming through the area. So you had ducks and geese and all kinds of stuff. So you had plenty of food. And they had a special aquatic plant that they really liked that was on one of the islands there. So we had about 60,000 Indians in the Portland area. But when the white people came in, you first had smallpox, then you had typhoid, then you had influenza, and finally malaria. And so after having been there for 6,000 years, within 40 years, they were extinct, gone. And very few people know the history of what was there before. They know these islands, and when these islands that are deserted. And when the first settlers came in, they basically found the countryside completely deserted, with old deserted villages with nobody in them, and nobody really understood why. And so the knowledge of that hasn't really transferred. So very few people know about the original history of the area that where I'm living. And so I'm now doing a lot of that research. As a result of this trip, I'm actually now putting together a team of people to write about the pre-American period in Alaska, so the Russian period, because I've learned about it because the Hudson Bay Fort is located in Vancouver, Washington, right across the river from Portland. That was the center of all the influence, the white influence that came into the area. And they were very successful, not because they were able to gather more beavers, which was the basic business of the Hudson Bay Company, was collecting beavers beaver skins, so they could send them back to London and turn them into top hats. Because that was the fur from the beavers was perfect for making hats. And that was the business of Hudson Bay, except in Portland, where they soon discovered that they could make more money by farming, and it was very fertile. So they had dairy farms, and they had butter and milk, fresh produce, and lots of fish. And that they then turned around and they sold that to the Russians up in Alaska, in Nootka and New Archangel. And so there was a lot of business with the Russians. They were selling also logs. So the beginning of the log export was as early as 1823, when they began exporting logs to Hawaii. Why Hawaii? That was the place where the Pacific fishing fleet would go if they got in trouble and they broke their mast, or they were in some kind of trouble from being in a big Pacific storm. They would go, the trade winds will take you automatically to what was then called the Sandwich Islands. And you would end up in Honolulu. The problem is you can't replace a mast with a palm tree. It's not a good wood for that. So they would bring the wood from Oregon to Hawaii to supply the shipyards there. They were supporting the fishing fleet. So if you think about Moby Dick and that kind of experience, that was all based out of the Sandwich Islands. So that's one of the sort of the historical facts that I've been working with. And I'm now looking at actually doing a lot more research on the Russian period and doing that possibly together with some researchers here so that we can maybe publish something in English and in Russian that would be of interest both to Russian people as well as to Americans to understand our joint history in Alaska. So anyway, I think that my purpose in talking to you was to explain a little bit on a personal level what it felt like going through the post-McCarthy period and how it affected my own choices. It was a very difficult period when I began learning about what had happened. I knew something terrible had happened, but I didn't really understand it. And it made itself felt in kind of odd ways that as a child it was very hard to understand. I remember somebody coming to our house and coming in and saying, "I've been fired." And I looked at the person and I looked at their clothing and there didn't seem to be any burn marks and there was no smoke coming off of them. And I couldn't quite understand what they were talking about because I didn't understand what fired meant. And again, it was during the period when a lot of people were being fired for supposedly being in touch with the Russians. And so I knew that was this sort of odd thing that was happening. And I remember I was a Boy Scout, and they then moved the location where the Boy Scouts met from a location that was out not in the army base. They moved it into an army base. Well, I had to resign. I had to leave the Boy Scouts. Well, it wasn't the Boy Scouts, the Cub Scouts, because my father didn't have clearance to go on the army base, because we lived completely separately from the American community. And when he wanted to go to the PX, my grandfather, who was the ambassador, used to collect the PX cards, and the PX cards changed color every year. So in January, we would call up one of our friends and say, "What's the color for this year?" And they'd say, "Oh, it's green." And so we'd call my grandfather. My grandfather would go through his stack of old PX cards, pick out a green one, and then send it up to my father. My father would put it in his wallet in such a way that when he flashed the card out, it wouldn't show the year, it would just show the color. And they would let him in. So that's the only way we were able to get American goods, is by sneaking into the PX. And I knew this was sort of strange. And I remember my father taking me for my first hamburger and milkshake, which is divine. But you know, it was something that we could do only infrequently because of our kind of tenuous relationship with the United States. So I grew up with all that, and that really sort of affected my thinking. And you know the rest of the story now. But anyway, I wanted to share some of those details a little bit, so you can understand what it felt like for someone who had grown up here in Europe, but was an American, but wasn't really an American, wasn't really German, was something in between. And so it's something that I've had to sort of struggle with my entire life. And I remember when I first started dating my wife, she decided she wanted to learn German. I said, "Well, why do you want to learn German?" She said, "So I can understand what you say when you're speaking in your sleep." Because so at any time when I had too much to drink, I would lose my ability to speak English, and it would lapse into Bavarian, and it still happens to this day. I don't drink that much anymore, but I do sometimes lapse into German. So anyway, I think I wouldn't conclude my comments at this point, but I'd be welcome any questions that you might have. So I'm going to take your question.
Yeah, we were talking about back in childhood being disappointed when you found out that you weren't really American. So
No, the other way around. I was disappointed that I wasn't a Bavarian.
Yeah, that you were an American and
right.
that you weren't a Bavarian. Have you?
I see. I'll get you next.
Have you come to treat the United States as, I don't know, your homeland since ever?
Very good question. So, as you can tell, my English is pretty good by now. And so most people in Oregon have no idea that I'm actually from Bavaria, if you will. And when I was doing some consulting work, for example, I would bring American companies from Portland to Europe, and we would be looking for joint venture partners, or we would be looking to buy companies or whatever. We'd be meeting with clients in Germany, and I'd explain to my clients that I spoke pretty good German, and then we would get into a meeting, and all of a sudden the German customers on the other side of the table would comment to my client, "You know, he speaks very good English." And my clients would go, yeah, what? So they had no idea that I spoke perfect German. So have I come to accept my Americanness? Yes. I grew up saying tomato. Now I say tomato. So I have fully accepted it. And in part, you know, I think when you make that change, when you go from one culture to the other, you have to find something that you have a passion for. And so for me, the outdoors and exploring logging roads that are far away from anything. So in the research that I did for my recent book, I walked for 7 years through this area, and in that entire time, I saw 3 people. Two of the people were Russians, because we have a large Russian population in Vancouver, and the other one was a Vietnamese. But all the Americans that I ever saw were in their pickup trucks, and they never got out of their pickup trucks. And I, being European, was raised walking. So I was walking through all these places that, you know, they would put up gates to keep people out. Well, if you're walking, I don't care if there's a gate, I can get around it. And you'll never find me because I'm on some impossible road that is fallen apart, so you can't even drive on it anymore. But if you want to walk on it, you can. So I would be way out in the middle of nowhere, and that was my passion, was walking these very remote areas. And I'm now quite well known to the Department of Forestry, Department of Parks, and to the timber community as being the guy that you want to go talk to if you want to know what's really going on out in the woods, because he's probably been there, and nobody else has. But again, it was you have to create a new passion, and then invest yourself into that, and then you will grow into your Americanness or whatever you choose to be. Does that answer your question? Okay. Gentleman in the way back.
I'm sorry for that question. You said you attended Reed University.
Yes, Reed College.
Reed College. And what if, to imagine that you would have attended like New York State University, what would be your day like back then, I guess?
You mean the difference between New York State?
No, if you imagine that you studied there, right?
Yeah.
You have studied there instead of Reed.
What would that be? Well, I mean, one of the big differences is that my family comes from the East Coast, and I knew what their life was like. We come from a fairly upper class background, and at one point, to give you an example, we were living in Philadelphia, and my family goes way back in Philadelphia. So part of my family actually sold land to William Penn when he actually established Philadelphia. So we're very old history in Philadelphia. So I was dating a girl in Chestnut Hill, which is a very fancy part of Philadelphia. And she came over to our house, and we have an oil painting of one of my ancestors over the fireplace. And she looked at that and she said, you know, that looks like my great uncle George Biddle. My father looked at her and said, that is George Biddle. And I suddenly found out that she was my second cousin. So, you know, that kind of ended the relationship. A little bit difficult. But you know, I didn't really want to live the life of a banker. I'm just not cut out for that. And if I stayed on the East Coast, I would have gone down that road. I would be working for, one of the big banking companies. And I would have gone on to Yale or one of those schools. Reed had a reputation of being a really tough school. It was essentially the alternative to going to Harvard, except it's small and it's on the West Coast. And I wanted to get to the West Coast. I wanted to get away from the East Coast part of America. It's a very different experience. So the West Coast is much more légère, much more relaxed, much more spontaneous, and a much younger culture. And the East Coast it depends on what you're doing, but the East Coast is much more structured, much more hierarchical. So you have lots of rich people, lots of poor people. On the West Coast, it was much more uniform. So you didn't have so many very rich people. This was before high tech. Now we have lots of rich people on the West Coast. But it's a different environment. It's a much more forgiving environment. But if you live on the East Coast, I probably would be a banker now, or doing something different. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to invent a new life, and that's something you can do in America.
Thank you.
May I ask you? So, you tell about little bit about punishment from special services in your country, yeah? Against your family, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
And in this case, I have a critical question, maybe. Maybe do you understand, I don't mean you support, but maybe do you understand personally Mr. Snowden? What do you think about him? And what do you think? Is it possible for him to come back to the United States? I know he dream about this.
Well, the answer to the second part of the question is no. I don't think Mr. Trump has a sense of humor. I think he would be fired very quickly. And that would be, he'd be lucky if that's all that happened to him. What do I think about him? My own thinking has evolved on this. You know, when we first started talking about WikiLeaks, it was in the context of transparency, and that there wasn't enough transparency. So there's a part of the population, a younger part of the population, like my kids, for example, who look at that and say, you know, we shouldn't have any secrets, and secrets are bad. And therefore, it's a good thing that WikiLeaks came along and sort of blew up all the secrecy that we had. That may be a good thing in the long run, but from my perspective, if you blow something up, you're still responsible for the mess you made. And so I think Mr. Snowden is going to have to deal with the fact that he did something very dramatic. And I think he changed the world in some ways, because now, you know, no information is safe anymore. And so you always have to deal with the issue of fake information. You have to question the source of information. And you can also be, I think one of the similarities to the McCarthy issue is that you can be killed from innuendo, from just suggesting something. And now with the president we have, you know, he suggests the most outlandish, outrageous things, and they happen. And right now is a very difficult time in the United States, I think, because the very nature of what is true is changing. So we have, you know, alternative facts. You know, what is this? It's crazy. I mean, we used to call that lies, but that's changing right now, because if you say a lie enough times, enough people will believe you that the effect is the same, and it has an effect. So I think he did something very dramatic. In the beginning, we saw it as maybe a positive thing because it contributed to transparency, but now we see what kind of a chaos it creates. I think there's also the other side of the question. If you talk about when you create fake news, how are you responsible? I think that that's beginning to happen. So one of the companies I work for is a cybersecurity company, so I'm very familiar with the whole technical issue of hacking and data theft. I think what's going to happen is that in the near future we will all be very skeptical of information, and we will look at where the fake information is coming from, and we will say, oh no, we won't listen to that. If you can take the example of the French elections, the information went out and it went thud, had no effect, because they knew, they'd just seen what had happened in the United States, and the fake information was effectively changed the results. Well, some people say it changed the results of the election. There's new data out now, essentially, that says it would have gone to Trump anyway, because they didn't really recognize that they had lost, the Democrats had lost the support of the working class, and they were no longer talking to the working class. And they were angry, and they were afraid. And who did they vote for? They voted for Trump. But, you know, the fake information was very clear to see after the fact. And I think the Europeans are now dealing with that in a very different way than we did. And that's going to come back to haunt and to hurt the people who are putting the fake information out. It's like the story of the little boy who cried wolf. You can only do that a few times before the little boy gets in trouble.
You talked about how your aunt knew his husband, but how did your parents met?
Oh, well, my father and mother met. My grandfather was the American ambassador in Rome, and my father was this dashing figure who'd come in out of the desert from Persia, and he was really sort of a Hemingway kind of character. He was bigger than life, and he could tell stories, all day, and people would just eat it up because he was a wonderful raconteur. And they met in Rome, and they dated a little bit, and then they went. One of the stories I remember is they went skiing in Gstaad, up in the Dolomites in Italy, northern Italy. And my father wasn't a very good skier, but he had lots of enthusiasm. So once you pushed him and got him going, he'd go very fast because he didn't know how to slow down. And at one point, I don't know if you're familiar with ski slopes in Europe, but you would sometimes have a farm right in the middle of it. And so my mother knew that it was much better to go in front of the farm where the front door was, because if you went around the back, it was all nice and white and had snow on it, but then you got over the edge and all of a sudden that was where all the dung pile, do you understand dung pile? It's when they clean where the cows are, and they clean it and they put the stuff that comes from cows that we don't like, that smells, and we put it in a big pile, but it's lower down, so when you're skiing from above you don't see it, and so you come to this little cliff and there's a big pile of hot steaming brown stuff, and so my mother knew that you ski around the front of the farm, not the back of the farm, but my father didn't really have a choice anyway because he couldn't steer, and so he just went right over and into the muck. And I don't know if that's what convinced my mother that she wanted to marry him, but that's how they met originally. Yeah, well, she could teach him a lot about skiing, but anyway, that's how they met, and this was just before the sort of the McCarthy era started. So he was still, if you will, had been touched by that. And for her it was very difficult because she was the daughter of the ambassador. She lived this sort of charmed life after the war in Rome. I mean, being the daughter of the American ambassador was a dream come true if you're a young lady. And you could go anywhere and do anything, and people were dating her. And my father probably was, evidently he was effective. But at any rate, she then had to go through this period. She married this gentleman, and then right away after that, all of a sudden the accusations came out from McCarthy, and they had to go into exile. So literally, they were living off my mother's allowance that she was getting from her father, and so she had a terrible time with that. She'd gone from living this wonderful sort of aristocratic life to being poor, having no electricity, no running water, no friends, being on some little island like Napoleon, and that was very difficult for her. She never really got over that. Okay.
With your bad experience of MacCarthysm, can you explain exactly actually what's happened with American politicians or military who had contact with the Russians? And where is the problem actually? The director of FBI has been fired by the president. What is the problem exactly?
Let me see if I understand your question correctly.
Yeah.
Your question is what's wrong with talking to the Russians?
Not
you can ask French. He understands
in
French.
English. En français, no. No, I mean, actually, you have a lot of people in America which have problem with FBI
Yeah.
to have been talking, to have been in contact with Russians.
Right, right.
So what is the problem actually? What is wrong with that? The fact to have been in contact with Russians?
I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I mean, the problem is what is your motivation? So if you're talking to the Russians and you've adopted the Russian agenda, then if you're an American diplomat, that's treasonous. But if you talk to them in the course of doing business, as in we're negotiating, then it's certainly the right thing to do. The problem is that I think not only in America, but also here and in many countries, foreign policy often gets affected by domestic political issues. And the McCarthyist problem was ultimately a domestic problem. It was a Midwestern senator who wanted he wanted more publicity, and he was a demagogue. And so he was able to use that accusation that there were communists hiding everywhere as a way to alarm people and to gain power from doing that. And so essentially it was a domestic perspective that was applied to the international side where it really didn't apply. Of course my father was talking with the Russians. Of course they knew each other. They drank together, they went to the same parties, they dated the same ballerinas, etc. That was part of it. But you have to then ask the question, what was my father's purpose? Was it to further the interests of the United States? Yes, of course it was. But how do you prove that? It's sort of like proving a negative. And you can't disprove it either. That's the problem. Is that somebody says, "Oh, you're a spy," but he's such a good spy that he leaves no clues, and that's why there's no proof. And the fact that there's no proof is proof that you're a spy. It gets crazy, and that's what happened. And we're seeing some of that today again, and it's happened in this country with the show trials during the Stalin era, and you're now seeing it some issues like that in the United States too. So the firing of Mr. Comey is a good example of that. Okay.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you very much for being patient with me.
And I'll just mention as well, thank you to everyone for coming. And Jim Thayer brought over this book that we'll give to the American Center. This is in English, Bears and the Caviar, the book that his father wrote about his experiences in Moscow. It's a really great, funny memoir, and it's an excellent book. So it will be available here that you can come and read, but it's actually about Charles Thayer, written by him.
It's really easy to read, and it's very hard to put down once you've started reading it. And it goes very fast. And we're thinking maybe about doing the next book, which is his time behind the lines with Tito in Yugoslavia. And at that point, very, very short story here, he was in charge of communicating with the Allies who were coming in to fight the Germans, and he was behind the lines. So every day he was out in front of his tent with a radio making reports back to the Allies. Well, in Yugoslavia, the Allies were, guess who? The Red Army. So he spoke fluent Russian. So here he is outside of his tent talking Russian all the time to the Russians and helping them to figure out how to get to cut the retreat of the Germans. And so the partisans, they only saw him doing this, and so they called him the Red Colonel, as they thought he was Russian, because they just heard him speaking Russian all the time. And the only language that the Serbo-Croatian, he also learned Serbo-Croatian, but before he learned that, the only language they had in common was Russian. So he was always talking Russian. But when it came to 1953, that was then held against him.
One more question.
Quick one.
Could you please explain why your father chose the title of the book, Bears and Caviar?
You have to read the book to know that.
She has to buy it.
No, she can borrow it here. But read the book. There's a reason for it, and you'll also find a description of a party that you may recognize from reading Bulgakov, Master and Margarita, because he was one of the people who went to this very famous party that my father threw, and it's the story from Bulgakov, where the Kayan is coming down the stairs. That's in Spaso House here in Moscow, and it's actually the party was actually done by my father, by an American. I have to leave. My ride is leaving. So, cheers.
Thank you.